From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump warning the economy may slow if the Fed does not cut rates, upping his pressure on Chairman Powell and helping fuel another sell-off. We'll have more with Mark Zandi at Moody's Analytics.
This is the president defends his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, after news breaks the Pentagon chief shared sensitive military plans in a second unsecured signal chat. And a former Pentagon official who just resigned warns of a full-blown meltdown in the Defense Department.
Former Congresswoman Jane Harman of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy will join us with reaction. Also get her take on prospects for a peace deal in Ukraine.
Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power as we kick off the week with President Trump putting additional pressure on Fed Chair Jay Powell. The ripple effect of the political posturing causing a tumble in equity markets today and renewing concerns over the president's willingness to meddle with central bank policy. In a post on Truth Social, the president saying in part that there is virtually no inflation and goes on to say that there can be a slowing of the economy unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates now. Joining us with the latest is Bloomberg's Kate Davidson, who helps lead our Fed coverage here in Washington. Kate, what's the realistic likelihood that the Fed chairman or the FOMC more widely pays any heed to what the president thinks about rates?
Well, I think that the chances are pretty low. At least that's what the Fed would tell us. They've said it time and again that they essentially just tune this out. And of course, we all remember that a lot of this, similar rhetoric took place during President Trump's first term in office. He had choice names for Jay Powell. I think he complained he was like a golfer with no touch. He couldn't putt. I mean, he had a lot of colorful tweets at the time about the terrible job that this Fed chair that he picked was doing, right? And so he's clearly, once again, he's not holding back. He's complaining that Jay Powell should be lowering rates. Just worth reminding that he's part of a committee, right? This isn't his decision alone. He doesn't have the interest rate switch over there that he can just flip. They're making decisions together. And what we've heard from a lot of the Fed officials over the past couple of weeks is it's very difficult for them to lower rates right now. They were lowering them late last year. It's difficult to make any moves when there's so much uncertainty around the direction of fiscal policy, of trade policy, immigration policy. So that seems to be the main reason they're waiting and seeing.
Maybe Jay Powell should reply on social media. So I guess Mr. Too Late is sticking. We're going with this, though we've heard a couple of uses of the name here by President Trump. The important part of what he wrote, though, is there can be a slowing in all caps of the economy unless, as he says, we get rate cuts. Is he projecting the inevitable?
Well, let's be clear. I mean, I think that the projections for the slowing of the economy are pretty widespread, but those are stemming from forecasts around the trade war, right? I mean, economists widely anticipate that this will weigh on growth and that it will potentially push up inflation. The president's not wrong to point out that inflation data that we've seen in recent weeks has shown that prices actually came in lower than expected, but much of that was from before the tariffs hit. And so I think that we'll be seeing quite a different picture potentially or as expected over the coming months.
Yeah, it's great to have you back, Kate. Bloomberg's Kate Davidson with us at the table here in Washington as we turn now to the market reaction following President Trump's latest criticism of Chair Powell. Bloomberg's Scarlet Fu is with us from World Headquarters in New York. Scarlet, are we to believe that's all that was here? Another spasm based on a social media post by President Trump? Does this have to do with earnings or a lot more?
That was part of it. It's not the only reason, certainly, but it's part of the continuation of this sell America trade that has really gripped markets, where people are trying to exit U.S. equities, which, of course, have done very well over the past 2 years. They're trying to exit U.S. treasuries, especially at the longer end. And they're also exiting the U.S. dollar, which is perhaps most concerning as well. We saw stocks open lower, and they never looked back. They ended up closing off their lows, but we're talking about fairly sizable declines here for the major indexes. Within the S&P 500, all 11 groups, and In fact, all 24 groups, if you slice it thinner, declined on the day. So this traditional safe havens of consumer staples or utilities, they did not fall as much as the other sectors, but they too were down as well. In terms of what's working, treasuries at the shorter end of the yield curve, 2-year notes, for instance, did rise. So that pushed yields lower on the 2-year. And gold also gained as well to yet another record high. Other currencies like the Japanese yen and the Swiss franc strengthened as well. And Bitcoin actually closed up on the day, too. One stock I do want to mention, though, is Netflix. It extended its gains, its post-earnings rally, now climbing for a 4th time in 5 days. Analysts are increasingly talking about Netflix as a resilient outlier here in a tough macro environment. And we saw how Netflix has managed to grow its subscriber base, certainly on the advertising tier, because those users, those subscribers who might be downgrading their subscription plan will now go to the advertising tier, which in the end generates more revenue per customer for Netflix. We're paying attention to Tesla, which declined by almost 7% on the day after Wedbush Securities analyst Dan Ives, who's a noted bull on Tesla, said that the car maker is facing a code red moment as it prepares for its earnings tomorrow. A lot of questions looming over whether Elon Musk, the CEO, will return to the car maker full-time or not. Look for that to be a big theme for tomorrow's earnings call.
And we know you have it fully covered on the close. Bloomberg's Scarlet Fu, thank you so much. Now, the White House today says President Trump stands strongly behind Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth after fresh reporting in the New York Times that he used a second unsecured signal chat to share Houthi attack plans with his wife and brother. Hegseth responded to the new allegations while attending the White House Easter egg roll today.
This is what the media does. They take anonymous sources from disgruntled former employees, and then they try to slash and burn people and ruin their reputations. Not going to work with me, because we're changing the Defense Department, putting the Pentagon back in the hands of warfighters, and anonymous smears from disgruntled former employees on old news doesn't matter.
That pushback from Hegseth came as a new NPR report claimed the White House was beginning its search for a new defense secretary, though the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt said that's fake news. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams. So, Nick, whether or not the White House continues to stand by its man here, it does seem that pressure is building, because we also had an op-ed from someone who just left the Pentagon talking about it being a department effectively in disarray under his leadership.
Right. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation here where you have Pete Hegseth, as you heard there, and the president himself essentially framing this as other people out to get the Secretary of Defense, when everything we've been able to gather so far is there is a huge amount of dissatisfaction within the Pentagon itself among people who Pete Hegseth put into place. So, you know, and this new revelation, it was a second signal chat. He included his wife, his brother in there. The issue, though, is that it doesn't seem like it's having any real effect so far. There is that NPR report, which we have not been able to confirm. But so far, the president's saying, listen, guys, try again. Signal stuff is old news. I'm not impressed. I still stand by Pete Hegseth. So that's sort of where we are right now.
You wonder where Trump would look, of course. You know, when Hegseth's nomination was considered to be on the rocks back in December, it was the name Ron DeSantis that emerged as a phone call that the president was making as maybe another idea. We're not hearing names like that now, presumably because the White House is digging in. But who would be on that short list?
I mean, you know, it could be Ron DeSantis again, but the White House, I mean, they do not want any names out there right now. I mean, that was a real sort of sliding doors moment when you had that conversation around Ron DeSantis, because you got the sense then, the reporting we had at the time was that the White House was really wavering on Pete Hegseth. There were a lot of concerns, but then this campaign, behind-the-scenes campaign, really kicked in among Pete Hegseth's supporters. Some of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party went around to senators, to some of the big critics, and said, no, we are not budging on this guy. The president is going to dig in, and we are not moving. It seems they're still deploying that strategy now.
Fascinating. We'll be keeping tabs on this with Nick Wadhams' help. Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams on our national security team. We thank you, and we'll continue to discuss this new Signal Group incident with Jane Harman, chair of the Commission for National Defense Strategy, coming up next on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
But first, leaders around the world are paying their respects to Pope Francis, who died early this morning at the age of 88. Mourners gathering just outside the Vatican tonight as we get word that President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump will be attending his funeral in Rome. Trump saying Francis was a man who, quote, loved the world and called for U.S. flags to be flown at half-staff in his honor.
Just yesterday, Vice President J.D. Vance met with Pope Francis at the Vatican. As you can see on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, their encounter here believed to be one of the Pope's final engagements. Vice President released a statement on social media today, writing, quote, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill. May God rest his soul," unquote.
The Papal Enclave elected Pope Francis in 2013 after the surprise resignation of his predecessor, Pope Benedict. Francis was the first pope from the Americas and led the Catholic Church for 12 years.
Recruitment's that's at an all-time high. The spirit in the armed forces is fantastic. No, great confidence. It's all just the same old stuff from the media. That's an old one. Try finding something new.
President Trump today responding to new allegations facing the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, along with overall disarray, as alleged, inside the Pentagon, alleged in two separate stories over the weekend, as the administration bats down a new report that it's begun to search for a new defense chief. They called it fake news earlier today. And with us now for her perspective, Jane Harman, chair of the Commission on National Defense Strategy, former Democratic congresswoman from California when she was ranking member on the Intelligence Committee. Jane, it's great to see you. Thank you. We've talked about Pete Hegseth before, going back to the first signal flap and some of the concerns about his past in the confirmation process. Will he survive this?
I don't think so. I thought he would go today because this is a busy news day and people wouldn't notice. But I really can't imagine after his inner circle. Let's understand, this isn't the big, bad Pentagon. This is his inner circle. Has turned against him, and most of them have either been fired or quit, and his chief of staff is considering quitting. I don't see what's left, and I don't think Congress is going to defend him this time. President Trump is for the moment. But the other hard problem, Joe, is who would take the job? If the job basically is do what the White House tells you to do, don't do things that are obviously prudent, such as saving the four-star 34-year Army veteran who heads the National Security Agency and Cyber Command, or saving senior women who are enormously capable in the Pentagon, or saving Africa Command, which is how we project U.S. presence in Africa, the largest growing continent on the planet, where China is everywhere, or threatening to eliminate the head of our command in NATO. I don't think those are sensible strategies, and I don't know if Hegseth played any role in them, but I don't see how the next person is going to be in a position to do a much better job. And I wouldn't give up if I were a senator, I don't think I'd give up my Senate position to take the job if one of the Republican senators who might be capable and might be asked were asked.
Jane, what did you make of the op-ed published in Politico by John Elliott, who, of course, just left the Pentagon, who described the department as being in disarray, it being a month of total chaos? What does that indicate about the health of not just the U.S. Defense Department, but the implications for national security?
Well, they're very serious. I just chaired this Commission on National Defense Strategy. We said the world is more dangerous, or as dangerous as any time since 1945. Threats from everywhere, not just big, obvious countries like China and Russia, but rogue actors, which are everywhere in the Middle East, surely, and internal threats. And how is the Pentagon going to project this warrior ethic that Hegseth keeps talking about if it's in disarray and if key positions have been eliminated? Also, we said that to defend our country, we need all elements of national power. That means soft power, which this administration is eliminating, not just eliminating human rights organizations and treasures like the Wilson Center, which I chaired for a decade, but eliminating so much of our humanitarian aid and our food aid and USAID, et cetera. We said project that embrace our partners and allies. We're actually telling Europe to go on its own and embrace the tech sector. I think that's happening. The tech bros are out in force, but so much of the rest of it isn't there anymore. And I worry about a homeland attack. I've been talking about that for a long time. A cyber 9/11 would be obvious. Both China and Russia have great tradecraft in that area, and so do rogue actors. So that would be a disaster for our country. And it also might be an invitation for the administration to do things like suspend posse comitatus and let our troops be inside the U.S. He's also thinking about suspending invoking the Insurrection Act. I don't know that our troops would be very enthusiastic about that role, again, given all the circumstances. But things like that will impinge on U.S. civil liberties in ways we have not seen before.
Jane, you talk about AfricaCom. There's a draft of a Trump executive order that's circling, I think you're referring to here, that maps out a massive reshaping of the State Department, including the closure of some key embassies, turning away from entire regions that we're currently focused on. We spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with Michael Allen at Beacon Global Strategies. His reaction to the reports here that the State Department is up to this. He's, of course, got his eyes, Jane, on China. Listen.
That is the battleground where we are competing with China for influence, the global South. I don't think it's a good idea for us to be shutting down diplomatic offices in Africa. Maybe there's something to be done in Western Europe and Canada, some consulates here and there. I'm glad they're taking a big strategic look at the State Department. God knows it needs some reform, but I wondered, like you did, about whether Africa was the place where we should be uprooting consulates.
So what's the motivation here, Jane? Are the isolationists winning the argument in the White House? I thought it was part of the Trump brand to push back on China.
Well, I totally agree with Michael, a good friend who was a very senior staff member of the Intel Committee when I was the ranking Democrat. Africa is the fastest growing continent on the planet. It's going to have a 50% increase in population by 2050. It has, I think, 52 or 53 countries in it. And at the moment, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's loan program to countries, is everywhere in Africa. And if we reduce our presence further, it's already quite reduced, we're giving Africa to China as a big market, as a big fighting force, as heft in China's buildup against us, assuming we're almost in a new Cold War and hopefully never in a new hot war. Makes no sense to me. And just to build on that, Michael was talking about the global South. Well, let's talk about the Southern Hemisphere here, where Laura Richardson, the very capable four-star woman, head of Southern Command, was relieved. I think no reason given. And where even in the Biden administration, we had no ambassadors in about 5 countries. Again, it's another gift to China. Makes no sense, no strategic sense.
Jane, we just have a minute left here, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but President Trump suggested when asked by a reporter today at the White House that he thinks there could be a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine this week. Given what we just saw with the very temporary Easter ceasefire that both sides accused each other of violating, do you think that's a real possibility?
No, I think on Russia's terms, sure. If Russia gets Crimea and all the territories it's occupied illegally in violation of international law in Ukraine, Russia will take that. But why would Ukraine take a deal unless there were some kind of peacekeeping force or a NATO presence against whatever borders Ukraine agrees to? Ukraine and Russia need to make this deal, not the U.S. and Russia. And saying, as we did late last week, or as the administration did, that maybe this is too hard, maybe we'll just walk away from the whole thing, is not very helpful here. This is the doorstep to Europe. We are, because of our role in NATO, very involved in a senior role in Europe. If Europe is attacked and Europe is under threat, we are under threat too. And it's very short-sighted to abandon the commitment to Ukraine that most members of Congress believe in. Not that they are doing much to voice that, and most people in the United States believe in, and I surely believe in it.
All right, Jane Harman, chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And coming up, Elon Musk may have received the lion's share of the attention as the biggest influence within the Trump White House. But today's big take peels back the curtain on the true architect of the Trump 2.0 agenda. We'll have more on that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Will you, if confirmed as director, faithfully follow the law? The Impoundment Control Act, yes or no?
Senator, we will faithfully uphold the law. The president ran on the notion that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. I agree with that.
Democratic Senator Patty Murray of Washington in January during the hearing for Russ Vought, who was nominated and confirmed to run the Office of Management and Budget. Vought has since become a growing influence inside the White House, including the implementation of the administration's broad cost-cutting efforts. And he's the subject of this week's big take titled, Russell Vought is the real architect of Trump's agenda. It was written by Bloomberg Businessweek columnist Max Chafkin, who joins us now from Dallas. Max, you write in here that Vaught's unique combination of loyalty and knowledge of how the government actually works makes him perhaps the most powerful person in Washington, not named Donald Trump, and yet it's Elon Musk that gets all the publicity. What do we actually need to know about how the dynamics are really working here?
Yeah, so Russ Vought is, as you said, the head of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is the part of the federal government that doles out congressionally appropriated money. It essentially is controlling the purse strings to some extent. Russ Vought is interesting because he played a big role in Project 2025. He wrote the chapter on executive power, the Office of the Presidency. He also played this role kind of during the 4 years between Trump's two terms as a sort of leading activist running this pro-Trump think tank that was putting out all of these papers about tariffs, about impoundment, about pretty much any idea that the sort of hard line faction within MAGA was putting forward. And he's also interesting because he served in the last Trump presidency. So he has this kind of understanding of how the government works and a very strong ideological worldview that's very aligned with Donald Trump. And those two things make him very valuable both to the Trump administration and also to this effort that Elon Musk is heading up as the sort of public face of attempting to cut spending within the federal government.
Well, Max, in our remaining moment here, you point out Vought got religion on deficits when he went to work for Senator Phil Gramm, who used to talk famously about wagon pullers and wagon riders. What does this former employee of Senator Phil Gramm think about potentially adding to the deficit in extending the Trump tax cuts?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, right? I think the goal, of course, is to find other costs and so other places to cut, and you're hitting on a core area of potential like ideological rift or whatever, or maybe some ideological inconsistency.
Fascinating. Max, thanks for joining us. Max Chafkin with a read that you don't want to miss at Bloomberg Businessweek. Thank you, sir. Coming up on Bloomberg, President Trump expressing support for Pete Hegseth. Despite the news of the weekend, we'll have much more on this next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
His inner circle, let's understand, this isn't the big bad Pentagon. This is his inner circle has turned against him, and most of them have either been fired or quit, and his chief of staff is considering quitting. I don't see what's left, and I don't think Congress is going to defend him this time. President Trump is for the moment. But the other hard problem, Joe, is who would take the job?
Jane Harman, the chair of the Commission on National Defense Strategy, just moments ago commenting on Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, now facing additional scrutiny over sharing sensitive military attack plans in another unsecured signal chat group. This latest one with his wife, brother, and personal lawyer. Joining us now for their reaction, our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to see you both again. It's interesting, Rick, the Defense Secretary earlier today, in denying This report actually referred to it as old news, he said. Old news from anonymous sources, suggesting that he was in a way confirming this, not just this one, but the other signal chat. Can we assume that he, in fact, shared these battle plans, and does it matter if they're classified?
You know, I think there's always going to be debate over what was the battle plan and whether it was classified. And that's sort of the distinction that he's used right out of the box is I did not send battle plans. Well, you can define battle plans a lot of different ways. But when you send out the jets that are used in the attack and where they're coming from and when they're going to be there, I mean, that's pretty sensitive information. So he's trying to hide under those kinds of conditions. But the bottom line is, you know, his own people who work for him, who he brought to the Defense Department, are not anonymous sources. They are on the record publishing their own views of what a meltdown the Pentagon is under his leadership. And so maybe there are other anonymous sources, but you got a bunch of people on the record here today.
Well, but he's suggesting those on the record are disgruntled employees, the kind of same language President Trump was using, Jeannie, as he continued to say that Pete Hegseth has his support. Do you really expect President Trump will be saying anything else so long as the media is fixated on this story? Would he really want to kind of play into the narrative by suggesting Hegseth is on the rocks or outright firing him and replacing him with someone else?
Yeah, I can't predict what President Trump will do, but what he should do is remove and replace Pete Hegseth. In fact, Kayleigh, he shouldn't have put him there at all in the first place. But setting that aside, you know, the reality is that Pete Hegseth is inexperienced, and it is showing. And I suspect what we heard about this second signal gate, if you will, there is more to come after this. And I don't know if you guys feel this way, but I feel like this is record speed for 4 or 5 people to leave the department, all of whom, as Rick just mentioned, are great, you know, friends of and have worked for a long time with Pete Hegseth, to leave and to turn around and to speak to the press and to write op-eds in this way. There is more here, and I think Donald Trump's going to have trouble hanging on to Pete Hegseth, particularly if there is more drip here.
You consider the 4 who have left. 2 of them were considered very close senior advisors to Hegseth, Dan Caldwell and Darren Selnick. You add Colin Carroll, the 3 issued a joint statement condemning this move. And then there's John Elliott, who left the department last week, presumably on his own accord, although that isn't clear either. He's the one who wrote the op-ed at Politico, Rick, and referred to a Pentagon in disarray under Hegseth's leadership. He also warned that there would be likely more shoes to drop in short order, with even bigger bombshell stories coming this week. You've been around Washington for a couple of scandals, Rick. Speak to us about the anatomy of a resignation and what might be required based on the news that we're going to hear, presumably in the next couple of days, that could change Donald Trump's view here.
Yeah, there's an old saying that there's always somebody ready to be in the barrel. Well, Pete Hegseth is in the barrel, and that means that he's got to climb out of it on his own because no one's going to lend him a hand. And like you said, John Elliott, he asked John Elliott to come in and serve as his head of public affairs. I mean, he's the guy that Pete Hegseth was depending upon to actually paint a positive image of the secretary and the work he's doing at the Defense Department and the military. So he knows what he's doing. And frankly, it's probably just one more scandal, away from Donald Trump forgetting his name, which would be typical. You know, I look forward to the moment where he says, "Oh, I barely knew the guy," and then you're in trouble. But I think the clock is ticking, and you got to believe the folks who've left when they say there's more coming, because that is so far turned out to be not a hollow threat.
Well, certainly there's more coming from President Trump this evening as he's taking to other issues on Truth Social, including a decision by the Supreme Court over the weekend to stay, essentially, his deportation of people to on these flights to El Salvador or Venezuela. He is talking on Truth Social, the first line reading, "I'm doing what I was elected to do, remove criminals from our country, but the courts don't seem to want me to do that." He goes on to say, Jeannie, "We cannot give everyone a trial, because to do so would take, without exaggeration, 200 years. Of course, due process for these individuals that the administration wants to deport has been the question here. And I'm looking at the 6th Amendment of the Constitution, which says the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. Jeannie, isn't our understanding of longstanding American law that he has to give everyone a trial?
Absolutely. And, go back to one of his favorite Supreme Court justices, Antonin Scalia, said you have a right, if you are a resident of this country, to due process. And as you just mentioned, Kayleigh, rightly so, the 6th Amendment provides that for you. That is regardless of what you've been charged with, what you have been accused of doing, even if you've come in the country illegally. And our own Supreme Court just said that. More importantly, you've got to provide these people with due process, Mr. President. And so while he may want to move very quickly, the law doesn't allow him to move quite as quickly as he wants to. And all he needs to do is obey the law and obey the courts. It's not asking that much. I mean, I keep thinking, imagine if he just said, we made a mistake. Please, Bukele, send Garcia back and we will give him the due process and then we will deport him. This story wouldn't be continuing the way it is. But he simply does not want to listen to the courts because he wants to amass power and he doesn't want to be checked by any institution, courts, media, educational institutions, anybody. And so this is par for the course with Donald Trump, and it is a sign of the continuing chaos in this administration that he just won't follow the rules.
Well, Rick, as long as this standoff continues, it looks like we're going to see more Democrats heading for El Salvador. Chris Van Hollen, the senator from Maryland, did the full Ginsburg over the weekend, came back having met with Mr. Abrego Garcia, talked about the win as he saw it. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or YouTube, you see them sitting down with what the president of El Salvador described as margaritas. That was actually in the senator's hotel. Now, four House Democrats, Rick, are headed to El Salvador to visit the CCOP prison, keep attention on this case. Does this help the Democratic cause or simply remind the electorate of why they voted for Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think they run the risk of fighting the wrong battle. I mean, Donald Trump knows exactly what he's doing, and it has nothing to do with Mr. Garcia. He happens to be a useful pawn in the game that Donald Trump's really playing, and it has nothing to do with immigration. It has everything to do with strengthening the laws around his presidency. I mean, he's doing this all under an emergency executive order that if is allowed to stand, can basically allow him to deport anybody at any time on his own will. That's what he's trying to accomplish. And he's using these tactics of deporting people to El Salvador, run by an autocrat who happens to be friendly with him. I mean, who we wound up paying $6 million to keep these folks there. It's all a setup in the sense that the real issue here is whether or not Donald Trump has power over the courts. And this is the fight that's happening. It's got nothing to do with what's going on in El Salvador. They're missing the point.
Well, so it becomes a kind of a question of the respect of the courts, keeping in mind, Jeannie, that we spent a great deal of our day here today on Bloomberg TV and radio talking about his latest attacks against the chair of the Federal Reserve, the potential that he could try to oust him before his term is up in May of next year. And many are saying that the Supreme Court weighing in on the National Labor Relations Board case could set the precedent for whether or not Trump has the power to fire not just a Fed chair, but any independent regulator. So how much really are we looking to the Supreme Court here for the direction that this administration takes on a wide array of issues going forward?
We are looking at them for so much because it is the institution, as Congress has decided not to exercise its oversight power. It is the other branch of government that is there. And, I think there is a method to this madness from the Trump administration of these consistent appeals to the Supreme Court, because the court made up of so many members from the Republican Party and people he has appointed, they don't want to push back at him at every turn. And so I really think there is a way in which the Saturday night, 1 a.m. ruling that he has to, not deport those folks, that is a win for the other side, the ACLU. But as you flip this around and you look at Jerome Powell and the NLRB case, they're not always going to decide against Donald Trump. The court seldom does that, and they won't against Donald Trump. And so even if he wins 50% of these cases, he's doing pretty well in amassing power. And that is enormously concerning, and it should be, which is why it shouldn't only be the courts that push back on Donald Trump. We do need the legislature to step in. And I thought Lisa Murkowski's comments over the weekend about the fear some of them are feeling were particularly important in that regard, because again, the court can only do so much. Donald Trump knows that, and he is going to play the referee as much as he can.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel on this Monday. Thank you both so much for joining us. And coming up, as we were just discussing, President Trump warning the economy may slow if Fed Chair Jay Powell doesn't cut interest rates. We'll discuss with Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Trump is trying to pass the buck to Powell for whatever market problems exist. Markets aren't going to bite on that, of course. They're very fixed on Trump. Secondly, you got a situation where, as you've been reporting, the Wall Street community is already reacting this time to the possibility of Powell's removal in a way that they haven't before. So that's a real concern.
Terry Haynes, founder of Pangea Policy, this morning on Bloomberg, discussing the market reaction to President Trump's attacks on Fed Chair Jay Powell, which continued today. He said again that the Fed should cut interest rates immediately or risk a slowdown in the U.S. economy. For more, let's turn now to Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics, who is joining us from world headquarters in New York here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Mark, it's one thing for the continued pressure to be put on Chairman Powell. We're growing a bit used to this, but the acknowledgement that if the Fed doesn't cut, the economy could slow down. Is this about getting the chairman set up as the scapegoat?
Well, that certainly would be the result, Kayleigh, or at least one of the intended results. I think the Chair Powell has a very strong case to sit on his hands and do nothing with regard to policy. Look, we've got these tariffs. They're massive tariff increases. They're going to result in higher prices for lots of different goods. It's going to raise inflation. And you also have inflation expectations that are very high, particularly among consumers. The combination of all that strongly argues that, the Fed should sit on its hands, wait and see how this plays out before it makes a move. So I think the Fed chair is on very strong ground. But, obviously, if the economy goes sideways, he'll probably take some of the blame.
He did pick Jay Powell, right, Mark? I had to go back and check again today, referring to him as Mr. Too Late, a major loser. What does Donald Trump actually think about Jay Powell? He had really nice things to say about him in the Rose Garden a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, that's the way it goes, Joe. I mean, that's a tough job. That's why Jay Powell gets paid the big bucks, because he's got a pretty tough job. Okay. And actually, it's probably never been tougher, right? When you think about tariffs, I mean, just stating the obvious, it puts the Fed in between the rock and a hard place. The rock is inflation, obviously, and the hard place is weaker growth. It does both. So what do you do with that? So that's what the Fed's predicament is, and that's why, poor Jay Powell's getting the brunt of all this criticism. But, if you listen to the economists, other policymakers, he's doing the right thing. He needs to stick to his guns. Number one priority has got to make sure that this inflation doesn't become entrenched. And once he's figured that out, then he can react to the weaker economy. Both are coming, and, it's a difficult needle to thread, but I think he'll be up for it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, but Mark, if both are coming, does the president have a point in Chairman Powell being, quote unquote, too late? Knowing monetary policy is going to operate with a lag anywhere, is there a risk that the Fed doesn't actually react until the detrimental economic effects have already hit, and it takes a while for the Fed's easier policy to help try to ameliorate that?
Look, the number one priority has got to be on inflation and inflation expectations, because we know that if inflation becomes entrenched, if it's not just a one-off higher prices, but it continues on and inflationary pressures continue to develop, then ultimately that's going to result in a recession, but a much more severe recession than otherwise would be the case. So you've really got to, nail this inflationary problem right from the get-go. Make sure that that's not an issue. Make sure that inflation and expectations are contained, and then you can train your focus on the weaker economic growth. So he's got to sequence this just right. But it's not his fault that this is the situation we're in. The reason we're in this situation is because of this trade war and these higher tariffs. So it's not the Fed's trying to do its best, reacting to what is really bad economic policy.
It was, in fact, November of 2017, Donald Trump alongside Jay Powell in the Rose Garden. Quote, he's strong, he's committed, and he's smart. Donald Trump saying about Powell. And if he's confirmed by the Senate, Jay will put his considerable talents and experience to work. Will he have to put his talents and experience to work in dealing with a recession this year?
I think recession odds are rising. They feel well over even to me at this point. I mean, obviously, a lot depends on what the president and the administration do here with regard to the tariffs. There's still an off ramp. Perhaps tomorrow, the next day, there's some deal, whether it's real or performative, it doesn't really matter, but allows for the tensions here to cool and for the tariffs to come in. If that's the case, we got a fighting chance to make it through without an economic downturn. As you know, Joe, the economy came into the year doing exceptionally well. It was growing strongly, creating lots of jobs. Unemployment was very low. Stock market was at a record high. Housing values were high. We had our problems, but minor in the grand scheme of things. So, the economy had a lot going for it, and it still does. So, yeah, this thing can be turned around, but the administration has to take an off-ramp here pretty quickly. If they don't, a few more weeks, another month or two, if we're still fighting this battle, I fear that it'll be too late. We'll be in a recession. And then you're absolutely right. Chair Powell and the Fed are going to be fighting recession, not high inflation.
Well, and all of this is providing the backdrop to the IMF World Bank meetings that are taking place here in Washington this week. We expect to get some updated global economic projections tomorrow. But we got some from Bloomberg today. Bloomberg Economics, our colleague Tom Orlick and the others over there are estimating that Trump's Liberation Day tariffs will shave about $2 trillion off of global GDP by the end of 2027. Does that sound like a realistic number to you, Mark?
Yeah, I hadn't done that calculation, but, the global GDP is about $100 trillion. So you kind of do the arithmetic. Yeah, that sounds about right, about $2 trillion. It may end up being more than that. I mean, obviously, a lot depends on how this all plays out. The other thing that is important is what the rest of the world does and how it responds. I mean, the Chinese have dug in. They're going to fight. But what is the European Union going to do? What's Japan going to do? That's really critical here with regard to how this plays out and how much damage it actually does to the global economy.
It's interesting. We're talking about $2 trillion, which is exactly how much Elon Musk had pledged to cut through the Doge, which is a number that he's backed off on a bit here. Presumably, they would have canceled each other out. Mark, I don't know where we're going here in the near term, but it sounds to me like you need to wait for reciprocal tariff reviews to end. Do you worry, though, about the confusion that might follow if unilateral deals are cut with, for instance, all members of the EU and any other trading bloc that we're talking about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, even if there are deals cut here and the tensions cool off, where do we go from here on this? And, how much more uncertainty will there be going forward? It doesn't feel like that's going to go away. So even if we're able to, get this nailed down here in the near term and we get beyond without all this, without suffering an economic downturn, it feels like there's this pall that's going to be hanging over the economy as we kind of work through the uncertainty with regard to the tariffs and the ongoing trade conflicts. The other thing is there's just a lot of other economic policy that's up in the air that we've kind of forgotten about, but is just dead ahead of us. I mean, we've got this massive fiscal spending and tax legislation, the reconciliation package that's kind of making its way through Congress, and that's going to come to the fore. And we've got this Treasury debt limit. That clock is ticking. The Treasury is winding down its cash, and depending on how you do the arithmetic, they're going to run out of cash sometime this summer, maybe early fall. Well, how's that going to all play out? So, and then you've got the ongoing Doge cuts and other efforts to rein in spending and jobs. So you add all of that up, there's a lot of things that are just going to be up in the air for a long time to come. So even if we get through the next month, 2 or 3 or 4 without a recession, it doesn't feel like we're going to kick into high gear here because the policy is just going to remain, so difficult to discern and, make it very difficult for consumers and businesses and investors to really take off here.
Framing the uncertainty in the economy and in the markets. Mark Zandi, great to have you back, Mark, Chief Economist, Moody's Analytics here on Bloomberg. Coming up, the 2025 spring meetings of the World Bank Group, the IMF, getting underway. We'll take a look ahead at what to expect from tomorrow's World Economic Outlook. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew with a big week ahead in Washington as world economic and finance leaders gather here to address the global trade crisis as part of the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Trade, of course, being a top priority amidst the U.S.-China tariff war, reciprocals. Kaylee, it's not a mystery what the theme will be.
No, and certainly that will be reflected in the World Economic Outlook we're expecting to get tomorrow. Could see lowered growth forecast, raised inflation forecast, all as a result of trade policy. And of course, we'll have that covered for you in the Washington Edition newsletter, as well as back here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.